Picture this. It's a freezing October night in 1904. You're standing on the deck of a Russian battleship, somewhere in the North Sea. The water is black. The fog is thick enough to choke on. Your hands are numb around your rifle. And then, through the mist, you see them, lights. Small vessels. Moving erratically. Your admiral screams that Japanese torpedo boats are closing in for the kill. You open fire. The night explodes with the thunder of naval guns. Shells scream through the darkness. Tracers light up the fog like angry fireflies. For 20 minutes, your fleet unleashes hell on the enemy. When the smoke clears and dawn breaks, you expect to see the wreckage of enemy warships. Instead, you find fishing nets, barrels of herring, and the bodies of English fishermen who were just trying to make a living. Welcome to the Dogger Bank incident, the night the Russian Imperial Navy declared war on some of the most harmless people in Europe, mistaking trawlers for battleships in what remains one of history's most baffling displays of military paranoia. This wasn't a split-second error in the heat of battle. This was a cascade of fear, incompetence, and the kind of logic that makes you wonder, how did anyone think this was a good idea? If you were the officer on watch that night, staring at those distant lights through your binoculars, would you have given the order to fire? Hold that thought, because understanding how this happened requires us to step into the minds of men who were absolutely convinced they were about to die. History is full of these forgotten lessons, moments where fear overrode reason and paranoia became policy. To ensure you don't miss our next investigation into the archives, join us by subscribing. Consider it enlisting in a different kind of naval expedition, one where the only thing we're hunting is the truth. To understand how a modern naval fleet could massacre innocent fishermen, we need to rewind. The year is 1904, and the Russian Empire is in trouble. Not the mild diplomatic incident kind of trouble, our entire Pacific fleet just got obliterated kind. The Russo-Japanese War had started in February of that year, and it was going disastrously for the Russians. Port Arthur, their critical naval base in Manchuria, was under siege. Their Pacific squadron was bottled up, battered, and bleeding. Tsar Nicholas II faced a humiliating truth. Russia's mighty navy, pride of the empire, was getting dismantled by an Asian power that Europe had barely taken seriously a decade prior. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. For centuries, European powers had assumed racial and technological superiority over Asian nations. Now, Japan was proving that assumption catastrophically wrong, ship by ship, battle by battle. The solution: send reinforcements. All the way around the world. Enter the 2nd Pacific Squadron, officially known as the Baltic Fleet. This was Russia's answer to disaster, a massive armada of 42 warships that would sail from the Baltic Sea, around Africa, across the Indian Ocean, and arrive in the Far East to crush the Japanese Navy and restore Russian honor. On paper, it sounded magnificent. The sheer scale was breathtaking. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels stretching across miles of ocean. In practice, it was a floating disaster waiting to happen. The man tasked with leading this expedition was Admiral Zinovy Rozhestvensky, Zino H.V. Rozhestvensky. Imagine being handed the most important military mission of your career, except your ships are outdated, your crews are undertrained, and your supply lines stretch across 3 continents. Rozhestvensky was a capable officer, experienced, respected, known for his discipline. But he was also a man with a temper, a rigid worldview, and an absolute conviction that he was about to sail into a trap. Friends who saw him before departure noted how haggard he looked, how his eyes carried the weight of impossible expectations. The Tsar needed a miracle. Rozhestvensky knew he couldn't deliver one. Because here's where the paranoia begins. In the autumn of 1904, European newspapers were buzzing with rumors. Wild, unsubstantiated, absolutely electric rumors. Japanese torpedo boats, small, fast, deadly, were allegedly lurking in European waters. They'd been spotted near Gibraltar, off the coast of Denmark, hiding in Norwegian fjords. The specifics changed depending on which paper you read, but the message was consistent. Japan had operatives everywhere, and they were planning to ambush the Russian fleet before it even left Europe. None of this was true. Japan had no torpedo boats in European waters. It would have been logistically absurd, strategically pointless, and diplomatically suicidal. The distance alone made it impossible. Japanese vessels of that era couldn't carry enough fuel to operate so far from home bases. But Rozhestvensky didn't know that. His intelligence reports were a mess of hearsay, tabloid panic, and the kind of xenophobic hysteria that gripped Europe whenever an Asian nation did something unexpected, like, say, defeating a European military power. The admiral became convinced that assassins lurked behind every wave. He ordered his officers to maintain maximum vigilance. Gun crews were kept on high alert day and night. Sleep became a luxury. Nerves frayed like old rope. By the time the fleet reached the North Sea, the men aboard those ships weren't just tired. They were wounds so tight that a seagull could have triggered an international incident. Which, in a way, is exactly what happened. Let's be clear about something. The Baltic Fleet was not an elite fighting force. These were sailors pulled from farms and factories, given a few weeks of training, and told to operate some of the most complex machinery of the industrial age. Many had never even seen the ocean before enlisting. Gunnery practice was limited because ammunition was expensive. Navigation training was rushed because the Tsar wanted his fleet deployed yesterday. Some conscripts arrived at the docks having never fired a gun in their lives, let alone a naval cannon capable of hurling shells the size of a man across miles of open water. And the ships themselves? A hodgepodge of aging battleships, cruisers that leaked, and support vessels that could barely keep pace. The pride of the fleet, the battleships like the Knyaz Suvorov, Kunyahz Suvorov, were impressive to look at but plagued with mechanical issues. Boilers broke down. Guns jammed. The coal they burned was so low quality that black smoke poured from the stacks, announcing their position for miles. Engineering officers spent more time repairing equipment than operating it. One cruiser developed such severe engine problems that it could barely manage 5 knots, forcing the entire fleet to slow to accommodate it. The crews worked in conditions that would horrify modern safety inspectors. Below decks, temperatures soared past 100 degrees Fahrenheit as stokers shoveled coal into furnaces that never cooled. The air was thick with coal dust and steam. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion regularly. Medical facilities were rudimentary at best. A few doctors spread across 42 ships, armed with bandages and morphine but little else. Sanitation was medieval. Disease spread through cramped quarters. By the time they reached the North Sea, a significant percentage of the crew was already weakened by dysentery and respiratory infections. But Admiral Rozhestvensky believed in his mission. He had to. The entire empire was watching. Failure was unthinkable. So when his fleet entered the North Sea on the night of October 21, 1904, he wasn't just commanding a naval expedition, he was leading men who genuinely believed death could come from the fog at any moment. The stage was set. The players were in position. And off the coast of England, near a shallow sandbank called Doggerbank, a group of fishermen from Hull were about to have the worst night of their lives. They had no idea a paranoid Russian fleet was steaming toward them. And the Russians had no idea they were about to fire on allies. The perfect storm of incompetence was about to break. October 21, 1904. The North Sea doesn't care about empires or admirals or grand strategic visions. It's a cold, unforgiving stretch of water that swallows ships whole and spits out wreckage weeks later. That night, it was doing what it does best, being miserable. The fog came in thick. Not the romantic, wispy kind you see in paintings, but the dense, suffocating variety that turns the world into a wall of gray nothingness 3 feet from your face. Visibility dropped to near zero. The temperature plunged. Deck crews huddled near boilers for warmth, their breath forming small clouds that vanished into the larger murk surrounding them. Water droplets hung in the air, soaking everything and everyone. Uniforms became heavy with moisture. Metal surfaces grew slick and treacherous. Aboard the flagship Knyaz Suvorov, Admiral Rozhestvensky paced the bridge. He hadn't slept properly in days. His officers reported that the fleet was making decent progress, roughly 10 knots, which was about as fast as the slowest ships could manage without breaking down entirely. They were on schedule. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Except nothing felt right. The wireless operators had picked up strange signals earlier that day. Coded transmissions in an unfamiliar pattern. Could be commercial traffic. Could be weather stations. Or, and this was the thought that kept circling back, could be Japanese scouts coordinating an attack. Rozhestvensky ordered radio silence. He didn't want to give away their position. The irony, of course, was that 42 ships belching black smoke and clanking through the water like a mobile industrial revolution weren't exactly stealthy. But paranoia doesn't operate on logic. It operates on fear. Here's something crucial to understand. The Russian command structure was operating on information that was weeks old, filtered through multiple layers of bureaucracy, and often translated poorly from the original source. Naval intelligence in 1904 wasn't satellites and real-time data feeds. It was newspaper clippings, reports from naval attaches, and rumors collected in port taverns. Some of their intelligence came from merchant sailors who'd heard stories third-hand. Other reports originated from sensationalist journalists who'd never been closer to a warship than a harbor tour. Admiral Rozhestvinsky's mental map of the North Sea looked like this: a dangerous corridor filled with potential ambush points, where Japanese agents had allegedly positioned fast-attack craft to cripple his fleet before it could reach open water. Every fishing village could be hiding torpedo boats. Every merchant vessel could be a disguised warship. The fog that night wasn't just a weather condition. It was a tactical nightmare that turned every shadow into a threat. The reality: the North Sea in late October was full of trawlers. Hundreds of them. British fishing boats from Hull, Grimsby, and other ports had been working these waters for generations. The Dogger Bank, a massive, shallow sandbank roughly 60 miles off the English coast, was one of the richest fishing grounds in Europe. On any given night, you'd find dozens of vessels there, nets deployed, lanterns lit to avoid collisions with each other. These were family businesses, passed down through generations, operating on tight margins and hard work. These fishermen had no idea a Russian fleet was passing through. Why would they? Naval movements weren't exactly broadcast in advance, and these were working men focused on filling their holds with herring and cod, not international geopolitics. Most couldn't even locate Manchuria on a map, let alone understand why Russia and Japan were fighting over it. The disconnect was total. Russian officers stared into the fog and saw enemies. English fishermen went about their business and saw nothing unusual until shells started falling. The first crack appeared hours before the shooting started. At approximately 8 in the evening, lookouts on the cruiser Kamchatka, a vessel that would soon become infamous for entirely different reasons, reported seeing suspicious lights off the port bow. Small, moving erratically, possibly approaching. The report was passed up the chain of command. An officer noted it in the log. Nothing happened. This wasn't unusual. Lookouts had been reporting suspicious lights, mysterious vessels, and potential threats for days. Most turned out to be merchant ships, buoys, or simply exhausted sailors seeing things in the dark. False alarms were so common that they'd become background noise. Officers had stopped taking them seriously, which is precisely how real threats slip through. When everything is an emergency, nothing is. But this time, the lights were real. They belonged to the Gamecock Fleet, a group of British trawlers out of Hull, working the Dogger Bank under the command of a skipper named George Henry Smith. 53 years old, weathered by decades at sea, Smith was doing what he'd done 1,000 times before, supervising his crew as they hauled in nets heavy with fish. It had been a good night. The catch was strong. In a few hours they'd head back to port, sell the fish, and he'd have enough money to fix his daughter's roof before winter set in properly. His fleet consisted of small steam trawlers, none longer than 100 feet. They were lit with oil lamps and riding lights, standard navigation practice to prevent collisions. From a distance, especially through fog, those lights bobbed and weaved with the motion of the waves. To a Russian gunner who'd been told for weeks that Japanese torpedo boats were hunting them, those bobbing lights looked exactly like a fast-attack formation maneuvering for a strike. Imagine you're a 19-year-old conscript from a village outside Moscow. You've been at sea for weeks. You're cold, exhausted, and terrified because your officers keep telling you that death could come from the darkness at any moment. Your hands shake from fatigue. Your eyes burn from staring into nothing. Every wave sounds like an approaching engine. Every gust of wind sounds like distant propellers. You haven't had a full night's sleep since leaving port. The constant rocking of the ship has left you perpetually nauseous. The food is terrible, hardtack and salted meat that tastes like leather. Now add this: you've just been ordered to battle stations. Again. For the 5th time today. Your gun crew stumbles to their positions. You load shells with numb fingers. The officer is shouting something about torpedo boats, but his voice is swallowed by the wind and the rumble of your own ship's engines. You peer through the gun sight. There. Lights. Definitely lights. Moving. Multiple contacts. They're not running in a straight line like a merchant convoy would. They're scattered, erratic, darting around like, yes, exactly like small attack craft. Your training, such as it was, consisted of an instructor shouting, "Fire," when you see the enemy. Nobody taught you how to identify vessel types in fog. Nobody explained what fishing boats look like at night. You were told, Japanese torpedo boats are fast, small, and deadly. That's what you're looking at. That's what you've been trained to believe. The officer gives the order. You pull the lanyard. Military disasters often hinge on a single moment, a hesitation, a question, someone brave enough to say, "Wait, are we sure?" The tragedy of Doggerbank is that no such moment occurred. There was no dramatic pause where reason could intervene. The Russian fleet had been wound so tight for so long that the spring finally snapped. At approximately 11:45 that night, gunners aboard multiple Russian warships simultaneously spotted the trawler lights. Reports flooded the flagship. Rozhestvensky, half asleep in his cabin, was jolted awake by the commotion. By the time he reached the bridge, his officers were already reporting enemy contact. Multiple vessels. Close range. Possible torpedo attack imminent. He had seconds to decide. In those seconds, decades of Russian naval doctrine played out in his mind. The standing orders were clear: if attacked, respond with overwhelming force. Don't wait. Don't hesitate. The Japanese had already proven they'd strike without warning. Port Arthur had been hit before war was even declared. Hesitation meant death. Aggression meant survival. That was the calculus, brutal and simple. Rozhestvensky gave the order that would haunt him for the rest of his life: open fire. Here's the horrible irony. Even as the first shells left the barrels, there were signs this was wrong. The enemy vessels weren't moving like warships. They weren't returning fire. They weren't even trying to evade, because they had no idea they were being shot at until explosions started erupting around them. One Russian officer, a junior lieutenant whose name has been lost to history, reportedly asked his captain if they were certain these were hostile vessels. The captain told him to follow orders. Another lookout noted that the targets seemed to be stationary, which made no tactical sense for an attacking force. His observation was ignored in the chaos. A third officer noticed the vessels were far too small to be military craft, but by then the shooting had begun and stopping seemed more dangerous than continuing. The fog created a kind of informational vacuum where assumptions became facts, fears became certainty, and the normal checks that prevent catastrophic mistakes simply evaporated. Each ship in the Russian fleet could barely see the others. Communication was done by signal lamp, which was nearly useless in the murk. So each captain made independent decisions based on incomplete information and collective panic. The result was a cascading failure where everyone was doing what they thought was right, and everything they did made the situation worse. In the trawler fleet, George Henry Smith heard the first explosion and thought a boiler had burst on a nearby vessel. Then another explosion. And another. Then he saw the muzzle flashes lighting up the fog like lightning, massive naval guns firing at point-blank range. He realized, with the cold clarity of impending death, that someone was shooting at them. He had no idea who or why. There was no warning, no chance to surrender or identify themselves. Just sudden, inexplicable violence erupting from the night. The trap that Admiral Rozhestvensky had feared for weeks had finally sprung. Except he was the one who set it. And the victims were allies. The shooting was about to begin in earnest. The first shell hit the water 30 yards from the trawler crane. The explosion sent a column of seawater skyward, drenching the deck and nearly capsizing the small vessel. For a frozen moment, the crew stood motionless, their brains refusing to process what their eyes were seeing. Fishing boats don't get shelled. That's not how the world works. Then the second salvo arrived, and the world stopped making sense entirely. A 6-inch shell punched through the crane's wheelhouse like it was made of paper. Wood splintered. Glass shattered. The skipper, a man named William Leggett, was thrown against the bulkhead with such force that he never got up. His crew, illuminated by the burning wreckage of their own ship, scrambled for cover that didn't exist. You can't hide from naval artillery on a fishing trawler. There's nowhere to go. The deck is open. The superstructure is minimal. You're exposed, vulnerable, and utterly defenseless against weapons designed to sink armored warships. Across the water, aboard the Moulmein, Skipper Smith watched the carnage unfold with the helpless horror of a man witnessing an execution he can't stop. He screamed for his crew to douse the lamps. Maybe if they went dark, the shooting would stop. 2 fishermen rushed to comply, their hands shaking so badly they could barely work the shutters. The lamplight died. For 3 heartbeats, Smith allowed himself to hope. Then the Russian searchlights blazed to life, and hope died with them. Massive carbon arc lights mounted on the warships carved through the fog like celestial judgment. The beams swept across the water, pinning trawlers in white-hot circles of illumination. To the Russian gunners, this confirmed their fears. They'd caught the enemy trying to hide. To the fishermen, it was the moment they realized this wasn't a mistake that would end any second. Whoever was out there meant to kill them. Aboard the Nyaz Suvorov, Admiral Rozhestvensky gripped the bridge railing as reports flooded in from across his fleet. The Oriole had engaged multiple contacts. The Borodino, reported torpedo boat wakes, or what they believed were wakes. The cruiser Aurora, was firing star shells to illuminate the battlespace, turning the fog into a hellish landscape of shadows and strobing light. Everything was happening too fast. Rozhestvensky had commanded ships in combat before, but this felt wrong. Where was the return fire? Where were the explosions from torpedo impacts? His targets were dying, yes. The searchlights showed debris and what appeared to be sinking vessels, but they weren't fighting back. Not a single shot returned. Not a single torpedo launched. Just vessels taking hits and dying silently in the fog. A terrible suspicion began to form in his mind. He turned to his flag captain and barked an order, "Confirm enemy identity. I need visual confirmation now." But the fleet was already committed. Once you open fire with a dozen warships simultaneously, stopping becomes exponentially harder than starting. Each ship operated semi-independently, captains making split-second decisions based on what they could see, which in the fog was almost nothing. The ones who could see the searchlight beams assumed someone else had confirmed hostile contact. The ones who couldn't see anything fired toward the sound of other ships firing, trusting that their comrades knew what they were shooting at. It was a perfect storm of organizational failure wrapped in smoke and terror. Time fractures during violence. For the Russian gunners, 20 minutes felt like 20 seconds, a blur of loading, firing, the acrid smell of cordite, and the thunderous percussion of naval rifles that rattled your bones with every shot. Afterward, many couldn't even remember how many rounds they'd fired. Their bodies had operated on pure training and adrenaline, bypassing conscious thought entirely. For the fishermen, those same 20 minutes stretched into an eternity where seconds felt like hours. Walter Welpton, a 19-year-old deckhand aboard the Minnow, watched a shell decapitate his friend. One moment they were crouched together behind a water barrel. The next, Welpton was alone, covered in blood that wasn't his, screaming into a void that screamed back with shellfire. He would never speak of that night again, not to journalists, not to family. Some things language cannot hold. Some horrors live beyond words, existing only as nightmares that wake you decades later, your sheets soaked with sweat and your throat raw from screaming. The trawler Resolute took a direct hit amidships. The boiler exploded, and the ship folded like wet cardboard. 15 men went into the water. The North Sea in October is cold enough to kill in minutes, but most didn't drown. They were crushed between wreckage or dragged down by nets still attached to the sinking hull. 3 survivors clung to floating debris, watching the lights of the Russian fleet pass by like indifferent gods. Not a single rescue boat was launched. The Russians didn't even slow down. On the bridge of the battleship Oslabaya, a junior officer named Lieutenant Klado, Klah had his binoculars trained on one of the enemy vessels, caught in a searchlight beam. He saw a small steam trawler, its deck cluttered with fishing gear. He saw men in oilskins, not uniforms. He saw nets trailing in the water. He saw, in other words, the truth. Klado turned to his captain and reported what he'd observed. The captain stared at him for a long moment, then made a choice that probably saved his career but damned his conscience. He pretended not to hear. Orders were orders. The fleet was engaging hostiles. Questioning that in the middle of combat was mutiny. But Klado's observation started to spread. Other officers, once they knew what to look for, began seeing the same details. The torpedo boats had chimneys, not funnels. They moved with the sluggish roll of heavily laden cargo vessels, not the knife-edge agility of warships. Some were literally dragging nets through the water, a tactical maneuver that made zero sense for an attacking force. The cognitive dissonance must have been extraordinary. Everything their eyes showed them contradicted everything they'd been told to believe. So most chose belief over vision, because belief came with the authority of the admiral and the weight of weeks of conditioning. Seeing the truth meant accepting that they were murdering innocent men. Believing the lie meant they were heroes defending their fleet. A few chose otherwise. On at least 3 Russian ships, gun captains independently ordered ceasefires, refusing to shoot at targets they could now identify as non-military. Their courage went unrecognized and unrewarded. In the official reports, these acts of conscience were carefully omitted. At 11:58, something extraordinary happened. A Russian ship fired on another Russian ship. The cruiser Aurora, maneuvering aggressively through the fog, passed between 2 battleships at exactly the wrong moment. Gunners on the Dmitry Donskoy, Dmitry Donskoy, already wound tight and trigger-happy, saw a dark shape moving fast through their field of fire. They didn't wait for identification. They fired. 2 shells hit the Aurora near the waterline. One passed clean through without exploding. The other detonated in a coal bunker, killing a stoker and wounding 5 others. The Aurora's captain screamed into the voice tube, demanding to know which incompetent fool was shooting at friendly vessels. The answer, of course, was everyone. This friendly fire incident, which would later become an enormous diplomatic embarrassment, actually helped end the massacre. Because once Russian ships started hitting each other, even the most paranoid officers had to admit that maybe, just maybe, visibility was too poor and nerves were too frayed for accurate target identification. Rozhestvensky finally gave the order to cease fire at 12:05 in the morning. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise. Gun crews stood in the cordite smoke, ears ringing, staring at each other with the dawning realization that something had gone terribly, catastrophically wrong. The fog lifted around 3 in the morning, and with it came the evidence no amount of denial could erase. Debris field. Bodies floating face down in the swells. Overturned hulls with registration numbers painted on the sides, civilian registration numbers. And in the distance, limping toward the English coast, the survivors of the Gamecock fleet, their shattered vessels trailing smoke and leaking fuel. One Russian lookout, tasked with surveying the aftermath, vomited over the side of his ship. He wasn't the only one. Sailors who hours before had been convinced they'd fought off a Japanese ambush now stared at the wreckage of fishing boats and understood what they'd actually done. They'd fired on allies. They'd killed civilians. They'd committed an act of war against a neutral nation. And worst of all, they'd done it while being absolutely, completely, catastrophically certain they were doing the right thing. That's the true horror of Doggerbank. Not that mistakes were made. Mistakes happen in war. But that every person involved genuinely believed they were acting correctly, following proper procedure, defending themselves against a real threat. The tragedy isn't that they were stupid. The tragedy is that they were sincere. Admiral Rozhestvensky stood on the bridge as dawn broke, watching the evidence of his failure spread across the water. His grand mission to save Russia's honor had barely left Europe, and he'd already created an international incident that would echo for decades. The fishermen who survived would never forget the night the ocean tried to kill them. The families of those who didn't would demand answers that satisfied no one. And the Russian Empire, already stumbling toward revolution, had just handed its critics another reason to question everything. But all of that was still to come. For now, as the Baltic fleet steamed away from the carnage, leaving the dead and wounded to the mercy of the cold North Sea, only one thing was certain: the world would want to know what happened. And the truth, when it came out, would be far more damaging than any torpedo ever could. By dawn on October 22, 1904, the Russian Baltic fleet had vanished over the horizon, leaving behind a scene that defied comprehension. Wreckage bobbed in the swells. Oil slicks caught the early light, creating rainbows on the surface of water that had turned red hours before. Fishermen who'd survived pulled bodies from the sea. Friends, brothers, fathers who'd left Hull expecting nothing more dangerous than bad weather and poor catches. The trawler Crane was gone entirely, resting on the seabed with her crew entombed inside. The Minnow drifted aimlessly, her rudder destroyed, half her deck crew missing. Skipper George Henry Smith, his hands still shaking, counted heads and came up short. 2 dead. 6 wounded. and absolutely no understanding of why. The survivors limped toward port, their vessels barely seaworthy, carrying wounded men and impossible stories. When they finally reached Grimsby and Hull late that afternoon, dockhands and harbor officials stared in disbelief at the shell damage. These weren't accidents. These were deliberate acts of naval warfare committed against civilian fishing boats in peacetime waters. Within hours, the news exploded across Britain like a secondary bombardment. The British press, never known for restraint, unleashed fury that made the North Sea fog seem transparent by comparison. The Times of London ran a headline that captured the national outrage: "Murderous attack on British fishermen." The Daily Mail went further, calling it an act of war by lunatics. Editorial cartoons depicted Russian bears firing cannons at sardine tins. Public sentiment wasn't just angry, it was volcanic. Parliament convened emergency sessions. Members stood and demanded immediate military response. War with Russia seemed not just possible but inevitable. The Royal Navy began mobilizing. Ships were called back from colonial stations. Reservists received telegrams ordering them to report for duty. For 72 hours, Europe teetered on the edge of a conflict that would have redrawn the world map decades before the Great War did it anyway. British fishing communities were particularly outraged. Hull and Grimsby had sent generations of men to sea, and now those same waters had become killing grounds. Widows marched in the streets demanding justice. Trade unions called for boycotts of Russian goods. Public meetings drew thousands, with speakers calling for everything from immediate war to international tribunals. King Edward VII personally intervened, urging calm while his government gathered facts. Prime Minister Arthur Balfour walked a diplomatic tightrope, balancing public outrage against the strategic reality that Britain had no interest in fighting Russia, especially over what might, possibly, be explained as a catastrophic misunderstanding rather than deliberate aggression. Meanwhile, in St. Petersburg, Tsar Nicholas II learned about the incident through diplomatic cables and felt his stomach drop. The one thing his Baltic fleet couldn't afford was a war with Britain before even reaching Japan. His admirals assured him it must have been enemy action. Surely Japanese agents had been present, provoking the response. Surely this was justifiable. Those assurances lasted until the international investigation began. Russia initially claimed they'd been attacked by Japanese torpedo boats operating alongside the fishing fleet, a story so implausible it collapsed under its own weight within days. No torpedo boats were found. No evidence of Japanese presence emerged. British investigators examined the trawlers and found only one type of shell damage: Russian. The International Commission, comprised of British, Russian, French, Austrian, and American naval officers, convened in Paris. For weeks, they interviewed survivors, examined evidence, and reviewed logs. The Russian delegation arrived prepared to defend their fleet's actions. They left mortified. Testimony from Russian sailors themselves proved devastating. Lookouts admitted they'd seen fishing gear through their binoculars. Officers confessed to having doubts about target identification, but following orders anyway. The cruiser Aurora's damage, inflicted by Russian guns, became Exhibit A in demonstrating how chaotic and poorly controlled the engagement had been. Admiral Rozhestvinsky, summoned to testify, defended his decision with the desperate logic of a man watching his career dissolve. He'd acted on intelligence reports. He'd followed doctrine. His men had seen what they believed were hostile vessels. In the fog, with nerves stretched thin, mistakes were inevitable. The Commission's final report, issued in February of 1905, was diplomatic in language but damning in conclusion. The Russian fleet had fired without adequate cause upon vessels that posed no threat. Compensation would be paid. Reforms would be implemented. But no one would face court-martial, because admitting the full extent of command failure would have been too humiliating for both nations. 3 fishermen died: William Leggett of the Crane, along with 2 deckhands whose families were told their loved ones had perished doing honest work in home waters. 6 others sustained injuries ranging from shrapnel wounds to burns. Countless more bore psychological scars that 1890s medicine had no name for and no treatment beyond "forget about it and get back to work." Russia paid £65,000 British in compensation, equivalent to roughly £8 million today. The money was distributed among victims' families and boat owners whose vessels were destroyed or damaged. It bought new trawlers and paid medical bills, but it couldn't restore lives or erase the night when the ocean became a battlefield without warning. The compensation process itself revealed the human dimensions of the tragedy. Widows testified about lost breadwinners. Children spoke of fathers who'd promised to bring home extra herring for winter storage. Elderly parents described sons who'd been their only support in old age. The bureaucratic language of the settlement, damages for wrongful death, compensation for lost equipment, could never capture the reality of families destroyed by paranoia. The human cost, however, extended beyond the fishermen. The Baltic fleet continued its doomed voyage to the Far East, where, 7 months later, it would be annihilated by the Japanese Navy at the Battle of Tsushima, Tsushima. Of the 42 ships that left the Baltic, only 4 would survive. Admiral Rozhestvensky himself was wounded and captured. The paranoia that had driven him to fire on fishermen proved prophetic in the cruelest way possible. He'd feared destruction by a superior enemy, and that's exactly what he got. But Tsushima was a military defeat. Dogger Bank was something worse, a moral catastrophe that demonstrated how fear, when institutionalized and weaponized, transforms ordinary men into perpetrators of atrocity. You'd think an incident this bizarre, this internationally embarrassing, would trigger fundamental changes in naval doctrine. You'd think procedures would be implemented to prevent similar mistakes. Training would improve. Communication systems would be upgraded. Someone, somewhere, would take the lesson to heart. Some reforms did occur. Navies worldwide began emphasizing target identification protocols. Engagement rules were tightened. The concept of positive identification before firing became doctrine rather than suggestion. The British Royal Navy, in particular, instituted mandatory recognition drills where crews practiced identifying vessel types under various visibility conditions. But the deeper lesson, that paranoia is a poor foundation for military decision-making, that fear-driven leadership creates disasters, that lesson went largely ignored. Because acknowledging it would require admitting that the entire structure of 19th-century military culture, with its emphasis on unquestioning obedience and aggressive response to perceived threats, was fundamentally flawed. 28 years after Dogger Bank, a German pocket battleship would shell Almeria, Spain, claiming they were under attack. The investigation would reveal they'd fired on shadows and dolphins. 34 years after Dogger Bank, the USS Panay would be bombed by Japanese aircraft who claimed they didn't recognize American markings. History kept repeating the pattern: shoot first, examine wreckage later, discover you've made a catastrophic error, promise it won't happen again. It always happens again. The Dogger Bank incident stands as a monument to a particular kind of failure, not the failure of courage or technology, but the failure of judgment under pressure. Admiral Rozhestvensky wasn't a monster. His gunners weren't bloodthirsty killers. They were people doing what they'd been trained to do, operating within a system that prioritized rapid response over accuracy and valued decisiveness over doubt. The tragedy is that everything worked as designed. The lookouts spotted potential threats and reported them. Officers evaluated the situation based on available intelligence. The admiral made a decision consistent with his orders and the prevailing strategic doctrine. The gun crews executed their training flawlessly. And 3 innocent men died because the system was designed to kill efficiently, not think carefully. This is the uncomfortable truth that makes Dogger Bank more than just a historical curiosity. It's a case study in how institutions can be simultaneously competent and catastrophically wrong. How the machinery of war, once set in motion, grinds on regardless of whether the enemy is real or imagined. How the cost of paranoia is always paid by someone else, usually someone who had no idea they were even in danger. Today, fishing boats still work the Dogger Bank. It remains one of Europe's richest fishing grounds, though overfishing and environmental changes have diminished the catches. If you stand on the deck of a trawler there on a foggy October night, the scene looks much as it did in 1904. Dark water, distant lights, the eternal sounds of wind and waves. The difference is that modern fishermen know the story. It's passed down through generations of Hull fishing families, a reminder that the ocean's dangers aren't limited to storms and reefs. Sometimes the threat comes from confusion and fear, from people who should know better making decisions they can't unmake. In Russia, the incident barely registers in popular historical memory, overshadowed by the greater catastrophes that followed: Tsushima, the Revolution of 1905, the First World War, the Soviet era. If Dogger Bank is remembered at all, it's as a minor embarrassment, a footnote in the larger tragedy of the Russo-Japanese War. But in Hull and Grimsby, they remember. Small plaques commemorate the fallen fishermen. Archives preserve their names and the circumstances of their deaths. Because while empires rise and fall, while admirals and tsars fade into history books, the memory of ordinary people killed for no reason remains sharp and personal. That's ultimately what this story is about. Not grand strategy or naval doctrine, but the moment when someone's husband, father, or friend went to work and never came home because fear overwhelmed reason 300 miles away. The archives are full of stories like this. Moments where history pivoted on decisions that seemed reasonable at the time but revealed themselves as catastrophic in hindsight. If these investigations into the past resonate with you, consider joining us for the next one. Subscribe, and we'll continue exploring the forgotten corners of military history together, seeking the lessons that still echo across the decades. Because the real question isn't whether we've learned from Dogger Bank. The real question is, what modern-day version of this incident is happening right now, driven by the same toxic combination of fear, incomplete information, and institutional momentum? What fishing boats are in someone's crosshairs at this very moment, while officers on a distant bridge stare at their screens and convince themselves they're seeing enemies? History doesn't repeat itself precisely, but it certainly rhymes. And sometimes, if we listen carefully to the echoes of the past, we might just avoid creating new tragedies that future generations will study with the same mixture of disbelief and sorrow we bring to Dogger Bank. The fog, after all, never really lifts. It just moves to different waters, waiting for the next fleet that mistakes shadows for threats, and fires into the darkness without understanding what they're destroying.